Good day, everyone. I am Karen Bonadio, Director of Alumni Relations, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this year's week-long virtual reunion. While we cannot meet in person, technology allows us to convene virtually, and we appreciate your patience as we navigate these events remotely. This webinar is being recorded and closed captioning is available. Thank you to all our reunion volunteers who have spent countless hours over the past few months planning, reaching out to their classmates, and fundraising. We have over 1,200 alumni registered from 75 countries with 15 programs run by the Alumni Relations Office and 35 plus individual class cohort gatherings. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Dean Douglas Elmendorf, Don K. Price, Professor of Public Policy, to kick off today's discussion with HKS Deans. Doug?
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Virtual Reunion. It is wonderful to have you all with us. Of course, we wish that we could be together in person, but traveling and convening in large groups still pose significant risks to people's health. So we will need to be content with coming together this year virtually. Around the world, we continue to experience human suffering on a horrific scale from the pandemic. My heart goes out to everyone who is hurting and grieving in Asia, Africa, and Europe, and the Americas. I offer my deepest sympathy to all who have become ill or lost loved ones or endure the social and economic consequences of the pandemic. And I'm grateful to everyone who has stepped up to serve others during this hard period. Today's panel is rich with Kennedy School deans. I'm here mostly as an observer. The discussion will feature 3 of my predecessors who are here to share their insights about the school and the role of the school in the world. I benefit every day from their perspectives, and this is your chance. The deans will be introduced by our moderator, whom I will introduce now. Debbie Isaacson is the Senior Associate Dean for Degree Programs and Student Affairs. Less formally, you might think of her as our Dean of Students. She and her team handle admissions and financial aid, student services and supports, career services, and other matters. Debbie is an attentive listener to our students, a trusted advisor to our students, and a forceful advocate for our students. Most important, perhaps, for this group is that Debbie is a proud alumna of the Kennedy School's Master in Public Policy program, as well as the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I feel lucky to work with Debbie and to be able to rely on Debbie every day. And I will turn the microphone over to her now. Debbie, thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug, for those kind words and for not revealing what year I graduated, because it's now many more years ago than I care to admit. But I want to say hello to all of you and to echo Dean Elmendorf's sentiments about not being able to be in person. What a thrilling turnout, though, anyway. It's really fantastic to know how strong and vibrant the community is, even if we can't all be together in person. It's also an honor to be able to join you and our 3 distinguished panelists for this conversation. We thought it would be fun to ask them a bit to do some reflecting on their respective tenures as dean, do a sort of walk through HKS history that'll probably resonate with many of you, and then to ask them to do some prognosticating about what the future might hold. So I'll start by introducing, or for many of you, reintroducing our prior deans to all of you, and then ask them some questions before opening things up for questions from all of you. Our first panelist is Graham Allison, who's the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government and was the founding dean of the modern Kennedy School. He served in that role from 1977 to 1989, and he's a leading analyst of national security with special interests in nuclear weapons, Russia, China, and decision-making. And until 2017, served as director of the Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. As you know, he's written several highly acclaimed books, including his latest, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? As Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Clinton and Special Advisor to the Secretary of Defense under President Reagan, he's been a member of the Secretary of Defense's Advisory Board for every secretary from Weinberger to Mattis. He has the sole distinction of having twice been awarded the Distinguished Public Service Medal, first by Secretary Cap Weinberger and then by Secretary Bill Perry. And during the first Clinton administration, received the Defense Department's highest civilian award, the Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, for, quote, reshaping relations with Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan to reduce the former Soviet nuclear arsenal, end quote. He served on the advisory boards of the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the Director of the CIA. Graham was the organizer of the Commission on America's National Interests, a founding member of the Trilateral Commission, a director of the Council on Foreign Relations, and has been a member of a number of public committees and commissions. Our second panelist is Joe Nye. Joe is University Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus and was Dean of HKS from 1995 to 2004. He has served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, and Deputy Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science, and Technology. He was the co-founder with Robert Keohane of the international relations theory of neoliberalism, and he pioneered the theory of soft power. His most recent books include The Power to Lead, The Future of Power, Presidential Leadership in the Creation of the American Era, and Is the American Century Over? Joe is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the British Academy, and the American Academy of Diplomacy. In a recent survey of international relations scholars, he was ranked as the most influential scholar on American foreign policy, and in 2011, Foreign Policy named him one of the top 100 global thinkers. And last but not least is David Ellwood. David is the Isabelle and Scott Black Professor of Political Economy and served as the Dean of the Kennedy School from 2004 to 2015. Since 2016, he has served as the director of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. He's also the chair of the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, which consists of 24 leading voices representing academia, practice, the faith community, philanthropy, and the private sector, whose mission is to consider what it would take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty. David served as the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services during the Clinton administration, and he was co-chair of President Clinton's Working Group on Welfare Reform, Family Support, and Independence. Recognized as one of the nation's leading scholars on poverty and welfare, his work has been credited with significantly influencing public policy in the United States and abroad. David is the author of numerous books and articles, including Welfare Realities from Rhetoric to Reform, co-authored by Mary Jo Bain, and his critically acclaimed book, Poor Support, Poverty in the American Family. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a senior research affiliate of the National Poverty Center at University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. I could go on for hours, but I think actually what you'd probably prefer is to hear from them. So gentlemen, I turn to you. Let's start first by looking back at your respective tenures as Dean of the school. Perhaps we can begin by taking a look back to understand what was going on in the world and what the state of the government was at the time that you became Dean, and how that affected your vision for the school as its leader at the time. Graham, I'll turn to you first. You're known as the founding dean of the modern Kennedy School, as I suggested. During your tenure, the school experienced significant growth, including the introduction of the MPP program. What was your vision at the time, and how did that connect to what was going on in the world and in government?
Well, thank you, Debbie, and thanks for the opportunity to be with alumni, even virtually. I second the proposition that it would be much more fun to see you in 3 dimensions, and we hope we'll see you back at the school soon. And I'm happy to appear with my decanal colleagues. There's a joke about what do you call, four geese or a flock, and I think 4 turkeys or a gaggle, 4 deans. One of our colleagues had a less appropriate term for that. I'll leave that to my colleagues to determine what are 4 deans. But to think back, it's a long time ago, but it's fun. I spent a little time this morning traveling back to memory lane. So, quote, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. Who said that and when? So I suspect most of our alumni can at least identify the author or the speaker, the Ronald Reagan, but I suspect many will have trouble remembering when, and it was his inaugural address in 1981. Now, Among the people who heard that most clearly was a young dean of a fledgling school whose mission was excellence in government. Was trying to build a professional school of government analogous to the schools of business and law and medicine at Harvard. But the president and the mood of the time said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. So a fundamental challenge at the outset was understanding and making, or trying to understand and make the case for government. Not for government as the solution, but as an essential part of the solution. Something without which a society simply couldn't succeed. I actually look back at the Oxford University did a handbook of schools of public policy, because this is now a fad globally. And they asked me to write a piece for it, and I looked back at it yesterday. Here's a quote from the Kennedy School's 1978-79 official register that I wrote, quote, "The challenge of the modern world is government. The dynamics of national politics, the reality of international affairs, and the increasing complexity of society all fuel a growing demand for government action on behalf of genuinely urgent and worthy causes. Government must act to ensure legitimate economic, social, and security objectives." So in the words of the Declaration, without government, how can a society establish justice, or ensure domestic tranquility, or provide for the common defense, or secure the blessings of liberty? So the core claim about government as a fundamental part of society, I believe, is incontrovertible. But the mood of the time, represented by Reagan and the Reagan administration, and by the era that's actually followed, is government as the problem. And I think that's been a fundamental issue for a school of public policy. It's a little bit like the business school during the Depression. Again, just for a bit of Harvard history. The business school was started at the beginning of the century with the theory that there was a profession of business that could be learned and taught. That was a pretty controversial idea. Actually, it was a controversial idea before that law schools could teach law. People used to become lawyers like John Adams by being an apprentice, or that medical schools could teach medicine. So the whole idea that there's a subject here that could be learned and taught is a controversial proposition. For the business school, when the Depression came, people said, well, maybe the business school isn't, look and see what it brought us. And during World War II, business school essentially shut down, became a training program for the military. So I think the issue of the necessity for government playing an essential role, not the solution, but an essential part of the solution in the society, was the fundamental question then and now. If I just say one more thing about it, in struggling with it, then we tried to articulate the case, not always successfully, but in a hostile environment, often against the grain. But we also thought, if we could recruit the most remarkable group of students who had a sense that government was an essential part of the solution, they would go on to be so successful that this issue would become moot. And I think that that's been the fundamental secret of the success of the of the Kennedy School, and of all the other Harvard schools from the beginning. The first public policy class, which this year is celebrating its 50th anniversary, had a most remarkable group of students. Nothing that the faculty could do to them would so disable them or discourage them that they wouldn't be successful, and then we would take credit for them. So I would say that was the most important piece of the attempting to deal with the issue. I think that remains, that's why the Dean of Students, and why we're fortunate to have Debbie in this role, plays such an important role in recruiting the very best people who understand that they're going to go and try to make the world a better place, mostly through government or through the working with government in public policy. Was the mission, is the mission, continues to be the mission. I could say more, but that's probably too much.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you for the kind compliment. It certainly takes a village. I'm struck by how some of those themes remain, right? The sort of struggle for salience and to make government an important profession, even while it underpins really everything we all do. Joe, I'm going to turn to you next. You started as dean in 1995 and led the school through the turn of the century, the most recent one anyway. How have things changed since Graham was dean? What was the landscape when you took the helm, and how did that influence your vision for the school? From the perspective of a student from that era, it seemed like one focus was broadening the aperture to make the school more international. Is that right? And what else can you tell us?
Well, let me pick up where Graham left off, and thank you, Debbie, for what you're doing. The United States goes through cycles in terms of the attitudes toward government, long cycles. And after the Great Depression and World War II, government was quite popular. It was a period in which there was a fair degree of trust in government. But as Graham said, by the time of the Reagan Revolution, you had a pretty profound mistrust in government. So when I was serving in the Clinton administration, it wasn't just that famous quote of Reagan's, it was also Clinton who was saying, we're going to limit government. Indeed, when I was asked to be dean in '95, it was shortly after the bombing of Oklahoma City. And here you had a fanatic person, Tim McVeigh, who felt so strongly about government that he went and killed, government workers, but also women and children in the Oklahoma City government building. I contrasted that with the fact that I was working with a group of people, 10-hour days or more, and they were extremely dedicated people. I mean, they were really devoted to the public service and to public good. And in a sense, taking on the job as dean struck me as a place where I could think about this strange idea that we had people serving in government doing a great job, and this extraordinary mistrust of government, which had become the popular ideology. So when I started as dean, obviously one of the things I had to do, is all deans have to do, is raise funds to support programs. And I used to joke that I had 3 strikes against me with most of the people who I was going out and rattling a tin cup for. One was the word Kennedy. The second was the word school. And the third was the word government. Yet despite that, we managed to raise a good deal of money and to advance a number of programs. One of the things we did was to indeed internationalize the school more. And we're 22% foreign students when I took over as dean. We were nearly 50% by the time I left. And people used to say, how can you give away such precious, scarce resources and entrance to Harvard to foreigners when they're American students who need it? And I said, each one of these foreign students ought to be thought of as a teacher who's teaching an American student about the larger globe out there. And I think that has been one of the key missions that we've had as a school. The other thing that I did was I started something that we called the Visions of Governance Project for the 21st century. And that was to pull together faculty and researchers to ask, what is going on with government? Why is there this trend? And how do we understand it? And how does it affect our own mission? The first book we published on that was called Why Don't People Trust Government, which grew out of a faculty study group. And we went on to have a series of books on governments and markets. What are the respective roles of each and how do they interact? But I think in the process of that, I came to see the mission of the school as somewhat broader than government narrowly defined. So we were not a civil service training college. We were basically a school for teaching public leadership. In that sense, that we started the Center for Public Leadership, but more than that, we infused our programs across the board with this idea. And the idea of public leadership was to be able to contribute public value no matter which sector you were in at a particular time. And that what I saw was that more and more of our students were going to be in different sectors at different times, sometimes in government, sometimes in the private sector, sometimes in nonprofit sector. But the mission of the school was to tell them and to help them so that no matter which sector they were in at any particular stage of their life, they could contribute public value. Not just private value, but also public value. And that, I think, has been a way for us to respond to this changing idea of the role of government and to have a mission which is both more global and broader in terms of what I called training trisectoral entrepreneurs, people who were contributing public value no matter which sector they're in at a particular time of their career. So in that sense, the school, as you said, we did broaden the aperture somewhat, both in terms of globalization and in terms of trisectoral leadership. But the thing I think that's interesting to me in terms of where we go now, and maybe this is a good introduction to David, is are we on the brink of a third turn of the long cycle of how we appreciate government? Are we going to see something where we're going to see the government sector being valued more highly again or not? I don't know. But that seems to be one of the key questions that we as a school have to come to terms with. I explained how I tried to come to terms with it in my 8.5 years as dean, but we're wrestling with it to this day. So let me turn it over back to you, Debbie, and then to David.
Thank you so much for that. It's certainly an interesting moment. I think there are many moments where we think we're seeing history, or we know we're seeing history in progress. And I think the onset of the pandemic is certainly one of those moments where we can see a pivot point. And I can testify to the fact that we have felt acutely the presence and the absence of our non-US students, so our international students, over this past year. The dispersion among our students has been both a test and a challenge, but also has given us opportunity for innovation. So thank you for sowing those seeds, among others, Joe. David, that leaves you. As Joe noted, he passed the baton right to you. So wondering sort of what was going on in the sort of prologue that Joe just identified informed your vision for the school at the time. By then I was a staff member, and it seemed like, again, there was more of this shift toward a focus on trisectoral leadership. But what else can you tell us? What can you share about your time as dean?
Well, thank you very much. And, you know, it's the old saw that you stand on the shoulders of giants, but I must say my two predecessors that were there really was quite extraordinary. And indeed, I'm one of the limited number of faculty members that have served under every single dean, starting with Graham and including Doug. It's interesting to see. Now, maybe during my, the world was pretty different during the time of my deanship. We started, when I started, George Bush was in the midst of being reelected. He was reelected in 2004. In 2008, a complete, poorly known fellow named Barack Obama became president. And so I've decided that the way to evaluate deans is the quality of the presidents that were elected during the time that they were dean. On that basis, I'm very pleased. Having said all that, yeah, when I took over, it was a different time. I think there was some greater sense of government's potential, and you know, even whether it was George Bush or Barack Obama, there was this sense that government had a crucial role, and it remained in some level of esteem, and I think a higher level than it had been in some earlier periods. But the school, still, people had several questions. I was really struck by how often I was asked this question. One was sort of, what is the mission of the school? But another was sort of like, are we supposed to train leaders or analysts? And, you know, what about the fact that, you know, 30 or 40% of your folks are going into the private sector and so on? This is a continuation of kind of Joe's issue. And, you know, my reaction to all that was, these were stupid questions. I mean, really incredibly stupid questions. And I chose not to put it that way. But to me, it was fundamentally obvious what the mission was. And each of the deans mentioned to make the world a better place. And it really is about advancing the public interest. And what distinguishes us from other professional schools like business and law school is it is a different question than asking what's in my client's best interest or what's in my shareholders' best interest. Those are very important professions. The society, they serve the public good interest in many ways, but the question on the minds of people leading those kinds of institutions and so forth is typically not first what's in the public's interest. And so to me, that was, and this is a continuation of the theme of Joe's, that was what we were about. We were about a place that really focused on asking and thinking about leaders that focused heavily on that question of what's in the larger public interest and what is the public interest and so forth. The second feature of, you know, that is this sort of question of how should we be worried about what professions people are going into? And partly the answer is as long as they care about the public interest. But I was struck by the idealism, as I've always been, that everybody I say comes to Kennedy School because they want to make the world a better place. And second of all, almost everybody comes in spite of someone they trust telling them to take a safer route. And that's, you know, that's a striking feature. My own father tried to talk my sister out of being a student at the Kennedy School. I mean, this is like a true story. Be a lawyer. You can still go to work and business. But I was struck by the idealism and so forth. But I was also struck by how many people felt, because of a variety of pressures, that they couldn't go into government or couldn't do that nonprofit or whatever kind of activity they wanted that would serve the highest purpose that they would like to be a part of. And a big part of that had to do with the cost of education. I mean, it is just absurd how expensive it is to get a Kennedy School education, or frankly, education even in college and so on. And so, yeah, no, I was all about saying, you know, I was around when we used this term, ask what you can do. And it really was about the public interest. But my theory, though, also was I had to reduce the cost of education. So my top priority pretty much throughout my deanship was finding a way to lower the cost of education, because I believed it didn't particularly bother me if people went into work in the private sector. Also, frankly, a lot of the private sector is doing public sector work. I mean, I was on the board of this group called Apt Associates. It's a classic, it's a for-profit company, but they do evaluations of social programs and a whole lot of other things. So, and what was really striking to me is though, when you talked about lowering the cost of education and found ways like public service fellowships and so on to make it less expensive, this question didn't come up anymore. By and large, people went to do things that really were, made the world a better place. And then it opens up so much when you can actually ask of the best of business, the best of law, the best of all these other professions, how they can work together and learn more effectively. Now, that said, it still means that you have to think about how you teach and what you teach and what kinds of questions, and those remain consistent throughout. And then, of course, at the later stages of my career, almost, I would say, eventually I conceded that really the buildings were getting pretty old that Graham built, and that we needed to refresh the campus and so on. And so that became an important priority as well. But I was struck, quite struck actually, by the difference that made. It certainly was a lesson to me that, in fact, you know, it is an obvious fact, but you know, the interactions you have just in the hallway, in the lunchroom, running into people is what a big part of what makes the Kennedy School great. And as those buildings aged and were, you know, they were separate buildings and all these other things, it felt like more and more people were working at home. Students were going to Harvard Square for lunch, not hanging around the school and so on. And when we did build those buildings and so forth, and they were really finished under Doug's watch, I really was struck by how much more people were interacting and connecting and so forth. And so the other important lesson I would say is that the chance to learn from each other, Joe talked about the international students, but you know, people who serve in all kinds of different ways, ranging from the military to social entrepreneurs to people in business of various sorts and so on. You know, there was just an extraordinarily rich learning experience. Having said that, you know, now, you know, Barack Obama was still the president when I was left at being the dean. I look at the world now, and I mean, I just found, for example, the last year or two, a near-death experience as far as I was concerned. I mean, the perils that were facing the world and the nation. You know, the pandemic was an obvious one, but you know, the planet, the injustice, a set of issues around inequality, and so many more. And you just sort of said, and talk about government was hardly anywhere to be seen, and really was part of the problem some of the time. Graham quoted Reagan, and so I found it really a quite disturbing time, and felt badly for a lot of the folks dealing with Kennedy School, and certainly the current dean, who has done a spectacular job. But and then suddenly we have new leadership in Washington, and we have a vaccine, and most everyone's getting vaccinated that I know, and a lot of people still need to. But still, in the U.S., we still have a huge way to go in the world, and so there's this sense of opportunity, though. There's this sense. You know, government is all of a sudden $2 trillion is not a big number anymore. I mean, when I was working on welfare reform, if I could get an extra $2 billion on something, I thought I just had hung the moon. I just couldn't believe it. And now it's trillions. And so there's this opportunity to do big things. And yet those perils are still with us. So we're at this moment of extreme peril. Democracy is really at risk. It still is. The pandemic is still a huge, I mean, just on item after planet. And certainly injustice and inequality. And at the same time, I've never had a greater sense of the opportunity to think really big, try big, bold ideas. The world was, partly because of the perils, there's a whole bunch of folks that really want to do something dramatic. And for me, the exciting thing and in some sense, the good fortune for a no longer new, but for me was the new next dean, Doug Ellendorf, is, to me, the school was invented for such a time, for a time of extreme peril and extreme opportunity. And we don't know how it's going to play out, but if there's any place that I think has as much potential as any to really help steer that ship and avoid those perils and take advantage of those opportunities, it seems to me the Kennedy School is that place.
Thank you, David. I will say that that hearing the history has been fun for me, and I hope it has been for the other alums who have tuned in. It's such a rare privilege to really hear what the thinking was from the top at those various points in time. I will also say that it might be a little known fact that my first job at the Kennedy School was working for David Ellwood in his office, and I did, you know, some writing for him, some introductory remarks, things like that. So it's perhaps not surprising that he has already trumped my next set of lines, noting the sort of moment we're in, both the pandemic and the impact it's had, grappling with racism here in the States, unrest around the world, climate change, all of those issues, I think, really do act as foundation and prologue for what comes next for the Kennedy School and the world. So I was going to ask you to sort of all collectively do what Joe did a little bit of and David did just a bit more of, but which is sort of look ahead. What do you see sort of coming down the pipeline for government and for the world? And maybe you could talk a little bit, David, you talked about peril and opportunity. So maybe you all could talk a little bit about what you think those opportunities are. What are the ways that that those of us going into government who are going into public service can be sort of helping the world or serving the world in big, bold ways? I'll throw it open to whoever wants to grapple with that first.
Let me take a shot because I think it picks up on what David said. I think this is as exciting a time as there's been in the life of the school, for the school and the graduates of the school making a contribution, because as David rightly said, there's not only the challenges out there, but there's a sense that the government can play a role, a significant role, as part of the solution to the problems. I think the impact of the vaccine, which was a miracle, created not by government mostly, not by government, but by the amazing intersection between the private sector and venture capital, but supported by government and enabled by government, including particularly the warp speed panel that basically bet $10 billion on the fly that something was going to happen, and that if it did, we would have a vaccine miraculously in 10 months rather than 10 years. Well, it's fantastic. But I think as Americans are vaccinated, and then as the world is vaccinated, where I think the US has an opportunity to play a role as the leader of that, this is going to be transformative. There's been an existential threat to people. It's got their minds, captured their minds about how they can take care of themselves and their families. So they've thought about this, the idea that a vaccine made by some interesting combination of the private sector and government, and they're available. Now, the impact of that then on the economy is going to be huge. So the economy is not just coming back, rebounding, is roaring back. So this is now a whole new environment. And then the idea that somehow or another, I don't still get it, but that people still all over the world want to send the US government money if it just gives them promises or paper. So what this does for our grandchildren, forget our grandchildren. For now, one can basically borrow and spend. And so the idea of another trillion or 2 trillion, I mean, we're most of us, even on the call, you old enough to remember the line about $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon it adds up to a lot of money, as David said. Now it's $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. I mean, basically the stimulus is 25% of GDP if you take the whole package. So money is not the problem. So what is the problem? Ideas about how money can be deployed to make a significant difference. And what are the challenges? Well, the challenges go through the list. Not just COVID, but our public health system. I mean, the failures of government at every level in the US to deal with this problem has accounted, by my count, for about 2/3 of the deaths. So if we had a government that had performed as effectively as Taiwan or South Korea or Singapore, to take a place run by one of our graduates, there would be 400,000 people alive today. We're not. Well, it's terrible. It's terrible, and it's at every level. So I would say there's opportunity there, the opportunity to try to restore American competitiveness. Basically an economy that hasn't worked for half of the population. That's Biden's problem, and he's struggling with it. Whether there's a feasible way to do that, nobody knows, but that's an opportunity to invent. And the China challenge, which has preoccupied me and Joe and others for a long time. This is the gravest challenge living Americans have ever seen. A nation that's going to be as big and strong as we are, and whose interests and values conflict with ours. How to deal with that. And I haven't even gotten to the social justice or other. So I would say, you know, there's never been a more exciting time for a faculty to try to be doing what a faculty of a school of government should do, kind of thinking about better ways to do this. And for students who are graduating to go and be playing a role. And I think if you look at the teams, at least that I know in the Biden administration, if I just take the group that's working the China problem, 80% of them have been either Kennedy School students like Sasha Baker, or Kennedy School fellows at the Belfer Center like Kurt Campbell, or teaching here, Jake Sullivan. So basically, for better or worse, we're part of the opportunity.
Thank you.
Debbie, let me pick up where Graham left off about COVID and the pandemic, which really has been a fantastic challenge to us all. Remember, it's already killed more people than have died in all our wars since 1945. I'll have a small disagreement with my friend Graham as to the role of government, in the sense that it depends where you start the story. If you look at messenger RNA and the work that was done in DARPA, which is the Defense Research Group, they started working on this in basically a decade ago. And the technology that went into Moderna, for example, really grew out of the Defense Department's efforts to develop a vaccine which could be multi-purpose. And that's where they started developing mRNA and so forth. So yeah, the Operation Warp Speed was important in the last bit, but there was a major government role before that. In any case, I wanted to look ahead rather than backwards, which is where should we go now in relation to this? We have been able to vaccinate almost half of the American population with at least one shot. But we have to, again, talk about broadening our aperture. We have to realize that you can't do this alone for one country. With new variants developing as the virus propagates in other areas, we find that if we don't do something about the rest of the world, we're going to suffer here at home. I wrote a book in the last year, published a book called Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. And there I gave the example of the Marshall Plan, where we could have defined the national interest after World War II as asking the Europeans to pay back the money that we had loaned to them. That's what we did after World War I. Instead, Harry Truman gave away more than 2% of our gross domestic product to support the recovery of Europe. And he did it because it was good for us, but it was good for the Europeans as well. If you take that analogy and you apply it to where we are with vaccination now, if we were to have something that was serious about a major export of vaccines to poor countries and have the government really put a major amount of money into it, we could be helping them and helping ourselves simultaneously. Ezekiel Emanuel, the provost of Penn, and I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal about a week or two ago, urging that the Biden administration speed up the export of vaccines from the US. Now, people will say, what? How can you give away something to the rest of the world where we haven't fully job here? The answer is a little bit like my point about having more fun. Wait a minute, you're actually going to help yourself. It's an example where, as we at the Kennedy train people to think of public leadership.
Joe, unfortunately, I think we're losing you.
Your connection is out, Joe.
Well,
this is the problem living in rural New Hampshire.
Well, thank you.
Okay, can you hear me now or not?
Yes.
Okay.
We're back on, Joe.
My apologies for our local internet. Anyway, my final point very quickly is the Kenny School contribution is to get people to think of things like the pandemic across sectors and globally, and to define the national interest broadly. And that's where we contribute to the public good. Yes,
and the good news for us is, the medical schools are busy talking about the Fauci effect of the pandemic, where they've seen a significant uptick in interest in students pursuing medicine. And we've seen the same thing, fortunately, here at the Kennedy School. So I think many people see the opportunities that all of you have identified. David, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything else before we open up for Q&A.
Yeah, just briefly, we just certainly amen to everything that both Graham and Joe said. And the only thing I would add to yours, Joe, is it wasn't just DARPA, it was the NIH, and it was a whole bunch of people in academia. So all of those together, and that just does show that complex problems do require collective solutions and so forth. But again, without government, I think both of those efforts would have failed. And just the lack of resources, and we would not have gotten where we've gotten on everything from the human genome and RNA messengers and so on. And I would just add to the list two points I would like to make. I think the set of issues around justice, which very much are about race and structural features but also class and economic justice. This is unsurprising given it's my focus and background. I think are just extraordinarily important. And really one of the great challenges of our time. They've been the challenges for all time, but now they are, we've had a variety of incidents that have brought them appropriately to the fore, and figuring out the ways to think about that. And it's extremely difficult because just like politics, this is deeply contested terrain and deeply contested narratives. And people have very different backgrounds and perspectives and facts even. And so, but when you look and see, I think in some ways, long before the pandemic, things like injustice and inequality were a huge threat to democracy and larger things as well. I think there's a very good case to be made that as we've oscillated between, think about it, we went from Barack Obama to Donald Trump, and both were sort of people with limited experience in government, appealing to dramatic, talking about doing dramatically different things and different change and so forth. So I think that's fundamental to kind of thinking about the question. And I think the school is really working hard. I'm thrilled with the kind of people that we've hired recently in social policy. Sandra Smith, an extraordinary African-American sociologist who was the head of the Berkeley department, who's now leading our criminal justice effort. But we have a whole bunch of other people working on these issues. I could list them all, but I mean, it's a really terrific time. And you see this across the school in different domains. So again, I think we can't take our foot off the gas here. And when we look at this very diverse group of deans, we could certainly establish that we could be a little do better. But I would also add something else. I think there is a risk that a school like ours, particularly having gone through the various periods we have, is better at thinking at the margin than thinking big. Thinking about how, I used to love to say, I don't know how to focus on poverty. I don't know how to get to the top of the mountain, but I do know which way is uphill. I called myself a radical incrementalist. And there's a lot to be said for that in normal times. I mean, really, you can't do big stuff. I mean, after the revolution, I used to say, but actually we're in the middle of a revolution of a variety of types. And I think one of the great opportunities and challenges for the graduates of the school, for the faculty of the school, for the leadership of the school, is to think about whether we are thinking big enough, whether we're asking big enough questions, whether we're thinking, okay, if you had $1 trillion to spend, how would you spend it? Not whether the last 100 billion or even 1 million was well spent and whether there was a better way to spend that last million, but could you really get to a very different place? And I think the jury's out on that. I'm not saying that anyone else is better at it necessarily, but I think it's a moment when we ought to think about that. And I think on all of the issues that we're talked about, there is a risk, and I think this is a risk of faculty, I think it's a risk for students and everything else, is that we focus inward on the same issues we've always focused on and say, you know, what's wrong with the school or what's wrong with this or that, instead of saying, how do we lead what is, you know, a kind of revolution, or at least how do we think about really fundamentally making changes in the world? Not just how do we make changes at the school or changes, you know, in our countries. And I think that's a really interesting and hard problem. But man, it would sure be fun to be a part of that.
I was going to have the same reaction. I think many of us are doing that in our personal lives, right? This year Ed Plus has given many people an opportunity to sort of reassess. And there is, you could either sort of see the future as a very scary sort of prospect, or you can grab it by the horns and say, this could be a really fun way to really revolutionize some stuff, to use your word. So thank you for that.
Just one last thing to add. This is a preoccupation of Joe's, but also of Graham's. And, you know, technology is just really an interesting issue. Is it the problem or the solution? The same thing, you know, so often. Shouldn't there be an app for that? Well, apps aren't usually, whatever. But I think it's really hard to make the case that technology has been really good for democracy. And yet it surely must have been, it surely has been. And yet, you know, it's an essential part of how we all live and will shape the future. So I think all of these things mean it's a spectacularly good time to be a Kennedy School graduate and involved with Kennedy School.
Well, on that note, I'm going to open things up for questions from our alumni. A few things before we get into the Q&A. One is to ask you to use the virtual raised hand feature in Zoom if you'd like to ask a question. And then someone on the alumni relations team will message you in the chat when it's your turn to actually pose your question. When it is your turn, please unmute yourself, share your name and your HKS affiliation. And though we're not physically located in the forum rules will still apply. So we ask that you keep your questions brief, and to quote at least one former dean, a reminder that questions end with a question mark at the end. So I'll get us started. We actually had a question come in via the chat, and it is the following. The Biden and Trump administrations do not appear to be heeding the warnings of Dean Allison's book on the Thucydides trap and on a collision course with China. How much does the existence of a large national security industry that is funded on emerging conflicts push US almost inevitably toward a conflicting relationship with China?
Yikes, a big question. So, Ash used to tease about Ash Carter, who became Secretary of Defense and is now back as the director of the Belfer Center. He used to tease that in the aftermath of the Cold War, it was very hard to justify the defense budget without an identified adversary. So you couldn't just defend against whatever. Okay? And it helps if that has a face. And there's no question, as Eisenhower argued wisely, that we have a military industrial security complex that even reaches to the academy, and that probably Joe and I are part of. So we view with alarm international security issues and are likely to be at risk of exaggerating. I think that's always on the one hand, but I think that's the small part, and the other hand is the much larger part. So I think that China, by every metric, is a meteoric rising power. So a country that had about 10% US GDP in 1990 is now 2/3 US GDP by the traditional exchange rate, and slightly larger, 20% larger by PPP. Never before has a country risen so far, so fast on so many different dimensions. So that's just a fact. China is rising dramatically. The US has been a colossal ruling power, basically for an American century. Historically, if you put that on the canvas, that's an argument of the Thucydides trap book. When a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, yikes, fasten the seatbelts, extreme danger ahead. Does this inevitably mean there has to be a conflict and war? No, and especially in the 21st century, where the combination of nuclear mad, China with a nuclear arsenal, and climate, where either the US or China can by themselves make a biosphere we can't live in, where we're basically inextricable conjoined twins. So the challenge for Biden and for administrations going forward is not to get to war, but to avoid war by somehow managing simultaneously what's going to be a severe competition and what's inevitably a degree of cooperation and partnership if we're going to survive. And I think the good news is that the Biden administration and Biden himself has an appreciation of this. I've written about it as Fitzgerald's proposition about the test of a first-class mind, to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time and still function. So maybe that's a Kennedy School mind too.
Fantastic, thank you. Next, we have a question from Luke. Oh, Luke says no sound. You want to type your question into the chat? Okay, here's another question. In what ways should HKS change in the future based on your experiences?
I went first, so David, maybe give you a chance.
You know, I think I've mentioned it. I think this thinking bigger, I think the school is working very hard on, but I think there are a set of challenges that are widely understood. And I think you just got to make sure you've really got the right combination of people. And I don't just mean faculty, I mean students and various fellows, various and so forth, to deal with the issues on the planet. I think we've got a terrific crew of people on issues of, we haven't done a lot on public health because we have a school of public health, but the question of where we are in health is a critical one. Obviously, a set of issues around justice and injustice, a set of issues around inequality. And I think this emerging question of whether democracies can survive, plus particularly the role of technology and all these things, I think those are all critical. Now, I think there are things the school's invested heavily in recently. We have a ways to go. There's no question about it. But we, but again, we have a brand new team of people in various areas like social policy. The other thing I would just say, though, is I do think the harder question for me is how to get people to think about big questions, since so much success has been tied to smaller questions. Now, Joe and Graham were both big thinkers, but it's what's a big solution to justice? Part of it's criminal justice, but more beyond. I mean, what would it take to dramatically increase or reduce poverty, to dramatically narrow the income inequality, and so forth? Those are big and interesting questions. Now, they can also be, thought about poorly, ineffectively, and lead nowhere. And so it's it's a challenge to figure out how to do something concrete while doing those other kinds of things. So, Joe, you must have some thoughts about how we can be better.
Well, I want to leave time for more alumni to ask questions, but I'll just echo what David said about the effect of technology on democracy. If you look at the issues of social media and their effects, The idea, should social media censor the president of the United States or the president of another country? And should the decision about whether the social media decision is correct or not be left to a little internal Supreme Court of a private company, Facebook, or should it be handled another? These are huge questions that we haven't begun to wrestle with. So this is just to underline what David said.
Terrific, thank you. Next we have Jacobo Garcia.
Hello, Deans. Greetings from Mexico. Good to see you. We know, as Harvard alumni, that good government makes a big difference. But one of the struggles I have had in my career is to convey this message to people around, for example, in election politics. And I sometimes use the example of the US, where we had an administration with a disastrous management of the pandemic, and then comes a new one, and just in 3-4 months changes things completely out of certain actions and initiatives. So the question is, how would you convey this message? Would you use like case studies, like for example, the example I gave? How would you think that it's a good way to convey this message that good government can make a big difference in people's lives? Thank you. This is for whoever wants to take it.
Well, I'll make 2 small comments, but it's a great question. So I think performance of governments, we have 200 governments around the world. We occasionally have challenges that look almost the same. COVID is a good example. And we have the track record of each of them. So I look at a country like Singapore, which president is a graduate of the Kennedy School. And I look at the percentage of the people who've died from COVID. And the answer is it's much less than 1 in 100 of Americans who've died. Well, my goodness, what are they doing differently? They're not different human beings. They're similar human beings. They're behaving differently as a government. So I think that's a biggie. I think to pick up on the previous question, just a small comment, I think the biggest question, as both David and Joe said, for the US today, and this is what Biden would say, is whether American democracy can work, whether American democracy has become dysfunctional as it was in dealing with the coronavirus. And I think that question is one that the school ought to have center place and ought to be debating and ought to be contributing to, because I don't think we're likely to give up on our conviction that a liberty-based democratic system is better than any alternative. But if alternatives end up performing better, then maybe we should look carefully and think even more broadly about whether there's some adjustments, substantial adjustments in American style democracy that would be required to make it more functional. And that especially, as Joe said, in an information age where there's so much overload of information that comes to people through their smartphones, that distinguishing between disinformation and accurate information becomes almost impossible for an ordinary person about most topics, because they're just simply consumers. They don't want to be analysts of what's true about this or that.
Joe, you should comment. Your whole life has been on this question.
Well, I agree with what Graham said. I do think, though, that to go back to Jacobo's question, how do you explain to people narratives matter? And being able to tell the story of how we're doing, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and where government has had a positive role is extremely important. And that goes back to leadership. Leadership matters. if you take, let's take Donald Trump's phrase, America first. Now, I would expect that most elected presidents have to say, my country first. That's what they're elected for. The question is not whether they defend the national interest, it's how they define the national interest. And that takes you back to my point about Truman and the Marshall Plan. It wasn't that Truman was putting Europe first, he was putting America first, but he defined it in a positive some way, which benefited Europe as well as America. And the same thing could be true if you had leadership relating to dealing with the pandemic. We have to define it not just as America first. Yes, we'll defend our national interest, but we have to understand that our national interest now includes the interests of others. And that's the power of a leadership.
Terrific, thank you. The next question came in through the chat. Any thoughts on how HKS and public leadership can address the erosion of public trust in information and facts? I'm especially interested in the multi-sectoral perspective of public leadership.
Well, Joe, you've been wrestling with that.
Well, the issue of fact and the devaluation of which has gone with the fragmentation of audiences under the impact of modern technology is a very serious question. In other words, if you can segment the audience, then each of us lives in our own little bubble, and each of us thinks we have our own little possession of facts. And then you have, what are the things that can cut across these bubbles? In the old days of broadcasting, you had, Walter Cronkite and talking to us, there were 3 channels and so forth. Now there are hundreds and thousands of channels if you include not just cable television, but also the segmentation you get on the various blogs on the internet and social media. And we have to think of more ways in which we can get across these different segmentations. And that again comes back to the role of leadership. Teddy Roosevelt said the presidency was a bully, meaning a good pulpit. And probably that remains true, that the president and other public leaders have got the best prospect of getting across these different channels, but it's not going to be easy. The fragmentation through technology is a real problem.
I would just like to add, one of the things I did do early on in my deanship, we had a project called Acting in Time. It was struggling with these questions where you could, like climate change, where problems that you could see a mile away, that it's very clear that acting sooner rather than later would make a huge difference. And yet we seemed unable or unwilling to act. And there are lots of, could spend forever talking about the reasons we don't act in time, but when you then ask, okay, how do you overcome the fragmentation we've just talked about of information, diffuse beneficiaries, very specific losers, and so forth? A big part of it is 2 things. One is finding a way to create something credible that goes across the spectrum. And sort of say, how do I get the people that would never believe me to believe this? And that's becoming more and more fragmented in the information age. And I went around the world asking countries that sort of said, Joe in effect alluded to the Walter Cronkite analogy. It used to be called the most trusted man in America. But I asked, what institution, person, or whatever is so credible in your country that if they said you must act on this now and sacrifice now for the longer good, it would change the conversation? And most people couldn't come up with a single answer. A few places would say something like the Catholic Church or whatever else, but that's a huge problem. And if everything such exists, then people will spend enormous time trying to destroy that person because they're a threat to the folks who want not to do those things. But there was a second route that often did work, which is what I would call the strange bedfellows route, which is when you brought together people, remember the hole in the ozone layer? That kind of got solved, and it got solved because a combination of environmental groups and Dow Chemical, who had an interest because they had an alternative, found a way to say, well, we got to get rid of CFCs and here's an alternative. And I think that one of the risks in the current political climate is we say, we sorry, can't work across boundaries. Those other people are too insane, and they often seem that way. But ultimately, to create credibility and a chance to really do hard problems, you've got to find a way to work across boundaries, which happened in preventing nuclear war. It's happened in various periods in the past. And I, applaud the talk now that both parties are offering, oh yeah, we want to work across boundaries, even though I don't see much evidence that it's happening. I do think in the long run, that is got to be part of the solution. You just got to find a way so that people say, well, geez, if Joe Nye and Graham Allison can both agree on something and they never agreed on anything before, it must be worth thinking about.
It's interesting that this sort of splintering effect that we're seeing and the divisiveness that we're seeing, there have been articles on the social impact of the pandemic and the fact that that's actually causing more entrenched sort of perspective. So I think another challenge will be figuring out how to first get out of that hole and then build the type of cross lines communication that you all are talking about. So thank you for that. We've got time for one more question, and we've got Lothar Ehring queued up to ask it.
Thank you. I'm MPA 2001. My question is on the distribution of vaccines in light of Joe Nye's remarks at the moment when his connection struggled. It's easy to say that a country should not, morally speaking, and for suppressing the virus, vaccinate only the domestic population and start exporting vaccines only when the last child, whose life is almost not at risk, is vaccinated. Likewise, it's relatively clear, although disputed, that a government under human rights and politically is primarily answerable to the domestic population. So do the deans agree that the right distribution is neither equal worldwide sharing nor full national preference, but where exactly do they see the golden middle?
That's a very tough and good question. I used to argue when I was writing op-eds about this that if you ask people to do the pure and saintly thing, which is totally equal distribution globally, you're going to fail. I mean, John Rawls in The Theory of Justice made clear that he didn't apply his theory globally. On the other hand, he did point out that you can have a concern for the welfare and health of others. I used to somewhat facetiously say there might be a 4/5 rule, that you give 4/5 of the preference to those who elected you, but you try to broaden their horizons to realize that they have an interest, both moral and practical, in the other, in, let's say, giving 1/5 of your vaccines before you've vaccinated everything. Well, there is no magic number, but the leader has to get away from it's 90 or 100% before we do anything for others. It's tough.
I think it's a great issue and would require another seminar, but the short version is that as long as leaders are elected by their constituents, they're going to be responsive to them first. And as one has listened to the public conversation about this, basically the have-nots have been very vocal about the need for things to be distributed, and the haves have been pretty determined to vaccinate themselves first. So I don't know of anybody in any country who's volunteered to give up their second jab after they got their first one to somebody in another country, even though in terms of any conception of social justice, all the 7.7 billion souls on earth are equal in God's sight. So I think this is a profound sort of gap between basically what would be moral in our moral conceptions and what would be statecraft. And Reinhold Niebuhr wrote a great book about that, which we could go back and read again, about the difference between morality for nations and morality for citizens. So I think it's a powerful, powerful question, and reminds us how a world organized in the unit of nation states has a level of selfishness normally that doesn't seem right if we think of it in terms of morality.
But I think, returning my radical incrementalist phases, I actually think that the question phrased as you did, Lothar, which is at the heart of the world at this stage, is too big, and that there are other alternatives to the ones, 1/5, whatever, And I think what's been intriguing, I've been watching the recent administration, is sort of like, look, we're not going to give you our vaccines, but we'll give you a ton of money to help, and we'll even think about whether or not we'll loosen rules about who can produce it under what conditions and patents and so on. And I think the easier theory usually is, let's make sure there's a whole lot more of this stuff, and therefore it won't be that long a wait. As opposed to, no, you can't start vaccinating, you shouldn't vaccinate kids, and when adults or whatever, all perfectly legitimate moral positions. So I think this is where the kind of Kennedy School thinking is actually enormously helpful. What are the other strategies you can imagine that rescue the leadership from having to do the thing like, sorry, you can't be vaccinated, constituent of mine, while I vaccinate that strange person far across the globe. Instead saying, we're going to figure out ways to do it both, faster, better. And that kind of thing, I think, is the easiest course to a win-win.
What a terrific comment on which to end this panel. Graham, Joe, David, thank you all so much for your time, for sharing your wisdom, for taking us on a walk through a bit of history, and for a truly engaging panel. I also really want to thank the Alumni Affairs Office for all of their help putting this together and running all of the logistics behind the scenes. And of course, thank all of you, our alumni, for joining us for this enriching conversation. And now I'll turn things back.
Can I add one last comment, which is to thank you and all of your fellows. This has been an extraordinary, in the best of times, you do an unbelievable job under unbelievably tough conditions, like you have to work for deans. But more importantly, the last year or two has obviously put you to the test, and just enormous pressure, enormous frustrations that everybody faces. And so I want to thank all of you. And then I think I'll take the liberty of speaking for all of the deans, who I'd say the best part of our jobs was always going out and seeing alumni, and the things they're doing. And it was kind of weird. You're just astonished by the things people are doing. And I don't know how you felt, Joe or Graham, but I had this kind of feeling like, okay, here's someone that graduated before I was dean. They never took a class from me. I deserve precisely 0 credit for this, but I felt such joy and such pride and such an honor that, these kinds of people are representing the school. So thank you for being a part of it, and do please come back and visit us in person.
Thank you, David. I will say, I recall you came back from a personal vacation once, having run into an alum on a shuttle heading from
10 alums. I was flying from Costa Rica, and the plane was half filled with Kennedy School students. And Dean Ellwood, I couldn't believe it.
Well, it's good to know that you're all out there. I'm going to now turn things back over to Karen.
Yes, thank you all, and thank you to all our alumni who joined today. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion, and please join us for other programs this week. Please remember to log into the Whova HKS reunion platform, either on your phone or on your desktop, for the most up-to-date reunion schedule, access event live streams, submit questions, and other features. Join us tomorrow for 2 alumni panel discussions on international development and climate change. Stay healthy and safe, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. Everyone.